Hi all, let's have a look at the FIDE World Chess Championship 2024 round 6. So Ding Liren against Gukesh. Ding Liren kicks off with d4. After knight f6 we get the bishop f4 London system. So Magnus Carlsen and Gukesh have popularized this, Gukesh many years before Carlsen. So this is, I actually do have a course on 2 bishop f4 London system. If you check out my Kingscrusher TV page, there's a course on the London system there with bishop f4. It is very solid, and you might ask, well, why are obnoxious openings, I would say, like the exchange French or the London system used? I got some help from GPT to have some key points actually for you. Simplicity and accessibility, so easy to learn, making them appealing to beginners and intermediate players. But you may say, well, this is a World Championship match. Surely, why are openings designed for simplicity and accessibility being used by these guys in this World Championship match? Basic principles, developing pieces, maintaining solid structure rather than deep theoretical knowledge. Well, maybe that's one thing. They want to minimize any potential damage if they go into some deep theoretical line. They're a bit conscious of the opponent's theoretical preparation. Solid and reliable. I think this idea of minimizing any potential damage, if you play in the wilderness of openings with potentially anything being thrown at you, you can sometimes get terrible positions out of an opening. When you play something like the London system or the exchange French, I think you're kind of minimizing the potential damage, minimizing the potential surprise that you could, the depth of any holes that you can fall into. So both openings aim for safe, stable positions, basically avoiding theoretical lines. The London system establishes a robust pawn structure and piece placement. This solidity gives players confidence, especially those who dislike chaotic or tactical positions. This is like a comfort zone. Avoidance of theory. Players can sidestep the vast amount of theory in more aggressive or complex openings. And with the London system, you can almost play the same setup regardless of black's response, minimizing the need for memorization. So there are benefits for these openings. So yeah, maybe a potential course of mine is, of course, an overview of the most obnoxious openings in chess going. They seem to be a favourite of World Chess Championship matches. So anyway, let's carry on. d5 is played, e3, e6. We have knight f3. If c5 had been played, we're not obliged to play knight f3. We can play knight d2. And one advantage of the bishop f4s without the knight f3, well, there's two advantages. We keep this diagonal clear. And on queen b6 here, we do have options, actually. Or we can just play knight g f3. We do have options here as well. More options sometimes with the early queenside attack. But anyway, yeah, knight f3, c5, c3, bishop d6. And now bishop b5 check. I'm pretty sure I've mentioned this line in my London system course. It's kind of an engine variation. The approach of bishop g3, it relies, for white to get an advantage here, it does actually usually rely on black taking on g3 at some point. If castling knight bd2, black can play queen c7. If black takes on g3, it gives white a bit of dynamic play on this h-file. And in fact, white could be able to claim a small edge. For example, this position, white could even cling on to the pawn and doesn't even actually have to use the h-file. This scenario, small edge. So yes, but if queen c7, we could have a situation where knight bd7, and here, this could be the right timing for bishop takes g3 now for e5. If black gets in e5 immediately after, this should be about even. This should be even. There shouldn't be any problems. So bishop g3, yeah, it's good news if bishop takes g3. We do get more options, but yeah, so maybe it's not a big advert for bishop g3 if it's relying on what black does now. If we played instead knight bd2, we could allow black to take on f4, but again, actually black might do best just to ignore that, because it gives again white kind of a dynamic pawn structure, which okay, it is kind of interesting, but it is about even here. It is about even. But if black just ignores it, this situation isn't so scary. In fact, with the pressure mounting on e5, not giving white time for queen f3 because of the pressure on e5. Let's say this situation, knight e7, and then b6. There's actually a critical game which Michael Adams had, where he got a good stranglehold on the light squares against Karyakin, and yeah, that's quite an instructive game. So this kind of position should be absolutely fine for black, and also it goes into tactics here. f6, trying to exploit this pin. We can play queen g4. Black can just play bishop c8 though. F takes here. This is leading to an advantage for white. If bishop takes e5, queen takes e6, and then taking on e5 with advantage. But bishop c8 would keep the positional point going, that actually this situation, black ends up with good light square control. D5 could be a very useful square soon. And this leads to a situation where it should be in black's favour. So in a nutshell, these situations, they're not such a big deal for black. So okay, that's some background. Bishop b5 check though. Whatever black does, this seems to be an interesting, well, relatively interesting continuation. Bishop b5 check, relatively novel. What else? Bishop d7, we're just going to take on d6. That's going to be a disaster, and then we can take on c5. So knight c6, offering the possibility of doubling the pawns. And that does happen, so it looks a little bit like Nimzo Indian's strategy to double the pawns. Bishop takes d6, queen takes d6, queen a4. Black castles. Now queen a3. If knight e5 here, doesn't really matter here. C takes d4 means that the knight's undermined. So it's too much. It's going into a ridiculous scenario to allow this scenario with the king still in the centre. That's too much for black. And there's also bishop a6 coming. So yeah, this situation though, c5, and again, this is just an even position actually. So queen a3, yeah, forget knight e5, queen a3 pinning that pawn to the queen. Knight e4 kind of unpinning because c takes is now possible. The knight protects the queen. Knight fd2, e5. If c takes d4, knight takes e4. White's going to get a small edge here in this scenario after c takes d4. Backward pawn on the c file. The knight actually can find good squares later. This is going to be a nice, comfortable, small edge for white. That's to be avoided. C takes d4 here, for sure. So e5, we have knight takes e4. If d takes c5, black's going to have an advantage. Knight takes c5. And here, rook d8, protecting the queen, unpins the knight. And for example, here, knight d3 is unfortunate for white, with b2 like going. So knight takes e4, d takes e4, queen takes c5, and this is a very accurate move, queen g6. If queen takes c5, this is going to be to white's favour because knight a3 is really a cool move here. Bishop d3, and then the other cool move is castling queenside. And this situation is just better for white. This is going to be a nice advantage for white. After the rook's double, there's even knight e1 to chase that bishop away, things like that, for example. Queen g6, yeah, very accurate. If we look at this again, yeah, white should play knight a3 here. Definitely not b4, by the way, because then a5 of this knight's ridiculous here in this situation. That's just a way of getting crushed, basically. Black's going to have a big advantage. So queen g6, though, very accurate. Instead of queen takes c5. Very accurate, looking at g2. We have knight d2. If queen takes e5, big advantage for black. Queen takes g2, and then bishop a6, looking at f1. Winning, basically. This is winning the exchange. It's a winning position for black. So knight d2, queen takes g2, castling queenside, very accurate. Very accurate move. Queen takes f2. And the point is, d takes e5 not only takes a pawn, but protects e3. Rook b8. Knight c4. Okay, adding more protection to both e5 and e3. We have bishop e6, rook d2, queen f3, rook e1, the rook was being hit. Bishop takes c4, queen takes c4, queen f5. We have queen takes c6, queen takes e5, queen d5. And it looks as though, well, at least white has some authority on the d file. Is that something? I thought it was during the live stream. Queen g5, queen d5, queen e7, queen d6, queen g5. So here, actually, a repetition is avoided, queen h4, so black playing for a win, perhaps, and it allows white to have this authority stamped on the d file. So yes, maybe it's a sign that Gukesh is playing for a win here, avoiding that sort of repetition at least. We have g6, and now queen e5, which here is the point the engine seems to think, well, maybe white did have something here at move 28. In theory, and I don't know if some of you have read Simple Chess by Steen, in theory, well, sometimes when we have a pawn majority, like we do here, the point is our king's there, so it's sort of dampening it down, this pawn majority, because as soon as we start moving the pawns, our king goes into danger. And the same with black's pawn majority, like here you could say there's a 2-to-1. These pawn majorities are very difficult to actually show advantage, but nevertheless c4 doesn't, it could be a very gradual advance. So this situation, as example, b3 frees up the queen just in case, and let's say queen e5, well, definitely here. White does have that authority on the d file, protecting h2. This does seem to be a position which should have been played on, because it looks like minimal risk. Say this did happen. I mean, this might not have happened, but it looks as though h4, white's pawn majority, seems to be in better shape than black's in terms of overall mobility. White's pawn majority here does seem to have more mobility going for it. Even though these two pawns are kind of isolated pawns, they're doing a good job of putting the brakes on black's pawn brakes. Basically, the brakes on the pawn brakes. If king g7, as example, let's just take this a bit further. Rook e6, and there's even a g6 target. This situation, for example, could easily lead into basically a winning endgame scenario. Yeah, if we put the brakes on black's pawn majority and we've got our pawn still moving forward, it's going to become, with simplification, the advantage amplifies here. So it does seem c4 was a way of playing for a win here. It does seem quite promising. But, Ding Liren is a human being. He's not a computer, and computers can see millions of positions a second. So maybe that's one of the problems here. But c4 does seem quite promising to engines. So queen e5 was played, just protecting h2. We have rook b to e8, queen g3, queen h5. If the queens come off here, this does look as though, is what I've said earlier, the same. Not really actually here. This is a scenario which black does seem to hold balance. Even if we sack the g pawn, black does seem to have resources to hold the balance with the e pawn here. This is just one fictional example. Let's say we go crazy with our pawns, a6 comes in. You see, this is the issue. When we've got passed pawns and our king is behind them, it's not that easy just to push the pawns to queen. a6 is a resource now to undermine. If b takes, rook takes, c6 is check. And here, for example, black just gets opportunities to take out these pawns. So here, for example, this is just going to be an even position. There's no big danger here. The rook has arrested that pawn. Tarash or rooks belong behind pass pawns, either your own pass pawns or the opponent's. So this is an even position. So anyway, so queen takes g3. It's not the end of the world, but queen h5 is played, keeping the queens on. Queen f4, queen a5. So a2 hit. Now, we do have the move a3 being played. Okay. If king b1, rook b8 seems sometimes dangerous for queen takes c3. So yeah, a3 was played, queen b5, rook d4, queen e2. It's like a nuisance queen. If queen b3, we're just taking out e4. e4 is an issue, so the queen's got to be a bit of a nuisance, hitting h2, sort of indirectly defending the e-pawn. Black doesn't really want to weaken the 7th rank. This is a recipe generally for disasters. If the 7th rank is weakened, that's a way of losing quickly, with lots of attacking options emerging all over the place. This is not something to be done lightly. That's compromising king safety. So rather counterattack the pawn. Don't touch king safety. Rook 1 to d2. So yes, if rook takes e4, it's just an exchange of prisoners, as Nimzowitsch would say, an exchange of weaknesses. And this is just an even position. We have rook 1 to d2, queen f3. If queen e1 check, a5, rook d7, white does have a small edge overall. So queen f3, we have king c2. If queen g5 here, this did seem like an engine suggestion to try for something, try for a small edge with queen g5. And I'm thinking if the queens are on here, sometimes if white has a ton of moves, like this, there's a mate pattern. But the thing is, black does have moves as well, and that's never going to happen. This position, this kind of attack is never going to happen here, because h4 rook b8, I'll show you why it's so slow. So it's so slow here, it actually loses horribly h5. Guess what black plays in this scenario for 10 points? Rook takes b2 check, and actually we end up getting mated. So given that's the case, h5 too slow, rook d1, and it just carries on being a kind of, it's just drawish, basically. White may have a small edge, but it's pretty drawish. So anyway, king c2 though is played. Queen takes f4, e takes f5. Now with the queens off, the compromise of the 7th rank isn't such a big deal. We have h4. If rook g2, rook d8 to exchange off a pair of rooks, this is just an even position overall. So h4, it has actually a fragmentational plan, as well as to dissolve itself as an isolated pawn, to try and fragment the opponent's pawn structure, or dissolve, either fragment or dissolve itself. So we have e3. If king g7, c4, let's have a look at this scenario where the king goes to h6. This is a scenario which is double-edged. This could really hurt black's king safety. There are some lines where the black king just gets mated. Let's take this scenario. Black's on the verge of potentially getting mated here after rook g4, rook g2, g4. If rook b8, b4, this is keeping an equality going. This is just going into an equal position. But let's say the move g4 had been played, rook h2 check, and here rook d2, and all of a sudden the black king is being mated. This wouldn't be funny or clever. So the ambitious plan to try and get h4 is double-edged. King safety makes things double-edged. Like I mentioned before about passed pawns, if your king's behind your passed pawns, it becomes double-edged by default. So okay, so c4, this situation, black would have to tread carefully. If rook d7 check, here rook f6, rook b8. This is also just an even position, actually. Okay, so anyway, e3 played, rook e2, rook e7. King d3, rook f to e8, keeping hold of the pawn. h5, so this kind of dissolving or fragmenting either is chosen. If c4 here, king g7, this situation, c5, king h6, b4, this is fun to consider as a kind of racing scenarios where both sides have passed pawns, but actually this is just an even position here. This here at least is an even position. Let me just rewind that back actually, instead of king takes h4, rook takes e5, this situation is a situation white can win the pawn race. It looks as though, you know, we've got a passed pawn there, they've got a passed pawn there, but actually white wins this particular pawn race. c7, rook c3, a4. You can see that the king blockades, slows down the opponent's pawns, and white actually wins this particular race. So yeah, we've got to assess like the pawn races sometimes, but h5 was played here. Instead we have g takes h5. Now if it was allowed for the other option, for h takes g6, it dissolves itself as an isolated pawn. b4 is just an even position. So g takes h5, which can be double-edged. We've seen in like some past like Anand against Carlsen World Championship matches where double pawns have been a winning thing in rook and pawn endings, where Magnus is able to play, you know, look at it after, it's absolute amazing accuracy levels. Is it the case here? Is this actually a dangerous pass pawn? Well, yeah. So let's see. Rook d5, we have h4, rook takes f5, rook d7 check. If rook d8 check, this is quite an interesting scenario actually to prove that black actually wins on king c4. This would be actually a mistake, a bad losing mistake. If king c2, that keeps it being equal here. This situation should be just even. That should be even. So it's funny, this situation with king c4, it turns out this would be like playing a part, an actor role in winning for black here, because rook d2, the rook moves back, e2, and let's say rook g1 check, rook g7, and now both rooks on that 7th rank, and here h3, a4, h2, rook h1, and there's a curious winning method here for black. What would you play to win? This is like a very curious winning method, I would say, for 200 points. How does black actually win this? You might want to pause the video here. This is an instructive variation, I would say. It's rook d7. The thing is, if we played rook d1, white has a resource, rook takes e2, undermining d1. So here, this is just kind of even. But actually with rook d7 here, the idea is actually to play king f8 and rook e7. So here, for example, king f8, rook e7, and this is winning for black. Yeah, there's some magic in rook and pawn endings. So anyway, yeah, that was with rook d8 check. But king c2 is played to just keep equality here. We don't need to play king c4. It looks a little bit scary to allow this, rook d2. And if rook takes d2, this position, rook e2, this is where the h-pawn simply just wins. So, okay, so anyway, rook d7 check is played, king c2, king g7, rook g2 check, and now it goes into a repetition draw. King h6 is a way of embarrassingly being checkmated. Can you see the checkmate here? There's rook f6 check, and rook g5 is checkmate. That pawn taking away the escape square. So yes, better idea is to just go back to h8, and here the players just repeat. So check, rook e2, king g7, draw agreed. Okay, so yes, it seems, yeah, that there's a lot of these very, very high stake world championship matches actually show up, in my view, openings that are fairly obnoxious in nature, and it turns out there's a duality to them. They're actually good for beginner to intermediate players as well. They have a simplicity and accessibility, you know, the Exchange French or London system. But yeah, I would describe them as obnoxious openings. So they seem to be cropping up in this World Championship match at the moment. So maybe both players are not ready for a big fight just yet. These last two games have been pretty steady and dull, relatively dull. And, you know, you could call them solid openings as well. That's another way of describing them. Okay, so draw here in this game. I hope you got some interesting points from this commentary. Please do check out my World Championship playlist, Kingscrusher TV /W C 2024. You'll see the other videos I've done so far for this World Championship match. And check out my chess courses at Kingscrusher TV. I do have a London system course for Bishop F4. Yes, it's about minimizing the potential damages that you can get in the openings. You won't get such a terrible position generally if you play the London system, and I do have a course on it with Bishop F4 you might want to check out. Okay, thanks so much.